Hey guys, so I'd like to go over a few things with the formal analysis paper that I noticed. I did finish grading them and give everyone some feedback, but there were some things that I noticed people kind of repeating over and over again. So I just wanted to kind of go over each painting. You can skip over the ones that you didn't do, or if you're interested in reading about or hearing about them anyway, then watch the whole thing or just skip to the section of the work that you chose. Overwhelmingly, most of you chose to write about Da Vinci's Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, which is very common. It's a popular choice. There's a lot of strong formal elements because this is a Renaissance painting, so formalism was very important. It was during the time when there was a development. A lot of these skills, linear perspective was developed during the Renaissance. So just a few things. One thing I noticed is a lot of you are getting the idea of hatching confused. There really isn't a lot of hatching going on here. Da Vinci was known for giving these very detailed, very smooth paintings where brushstrokes were quite hard to see. So this texture here that's on her arm, for example, we wouldn't consider that hatching. We'd consider that, he's giving us the texture of the fabric. He's giving us very smooth details there, but it's the idea, we would say this is more implied visual texture. Also, one thing that some of you somewhat missed is that there really is a triadic color scheme of primary colors. Here we have red, we have blue, and we would actually consider the skin tone to be in the yellow family because it's that kind of warm golden hue. So sometimes these color schemes aren't directly obvious. They can be kind of subtle. And one way we would describe this as well is the saturation of the colors is quite dull. The value is, a little bit less saturated, for example. So this isn't a bright pure red. It's a less saturated red. So we could describe it that way. And with the yellow as well, we would kind of say that this isn't a highly saturated yellow. And he uses these colors, and this is kind of part of Da Vinci's style. He kind of uses these really rich, warm, but more dull, earthy colors throughout all of his work, if you look. He's not known for giving these really bright, energetic paintings. They're very balanced. Only a couple of you picked up on this whole concept of the triangle here as well. So if you look, this whole structure is a triangle. This was considered a very balanced form in Renaissance art, and Renaissance art was all about being balanced. So when we talk about linear perspective here, this is a tricky one, and it's hard to tell because, there's so much going on. There's a lot of atmospheric perspective. These mountains in the back are quite lighter than the ones here, and so we know that they're further away. And as it gets kind of lighter as it goes back and back into this kind of void of space, this really is more of a one-point linear perspective. Da Vinci's just so good at it that he's kind of tricky with the way he presents it. And it's funny because Jesus is actually not quite even the central point or figure, even though he's the brightest, and there is an implied line down her arm to bring us to Jesus and the Lamb, which of course is a symbol of the Lamb of God. And so this is kind of, presenting him as one and the same. And I love how the trees back here kind of frame almost a crown or a halo around his head. But Mary and St. Anne are really kind of these, larger than life figures. You can see St. Anne is actually much larger than she should be. And this is done really subtly, but this is something that was common in this time period as well, more kind of in the early Renaissance and in the Gothic era to present important or dominating figures as being somewhat larger. But because she's not really the most important figure, she's not completely out of scale, but she's kind of presented as this larger motherly figure that, Mary is sitting on her lap. So those are some things to just be aware of. A lot of you did really well picking up on, value shifts and the idea of light and shadow. There's this kind of, where is the light source even coming from idea that Da Vinci's really good at. So just a few things I wanted you to be aware of here. And I love the details down here and the way he's rendered all of the landscape. Okay, only two of you, maybe three, two or three of you picked Matisse's Le Bonheur de Vivre which means the joy of life. And I understand this is a very iconic painting and a really important one in the world of modern art. But it's a hard one to do formal analysis on if you're not really confident in these elements of design. But what Matisse does is kind of the lack of some formal elements is what gives this painting its modern edge and lets us know that it's an abstract modernist painting that really kind of paved the way for a lot of the other modernists, especially the German expressionists. He was considered one of the fauves, Henri Matisse, kind of early on in his career. And fauve means wild beast, and it was kind of a criticism from the art critics that they paint like wild beasts. But definitely you'd want to pick up on the idea of arbitrary color here, which I believe those of you who wrote about this did. We could definitely talk about line quality, that it's very loose. It's a little more chaotic, a little less structured. Clearly, these figures feel kind of dropped into place. There's not really a sense of linear perspective. There is some implied sense of depth. For example, this kind of opening in the trees with this idea, it looks like there's, you know, the ocean back here and this kind of light pink sky gives us the idea that, okay, this is in the foreground, this is in front of us, and this is kind of moving back. But there's no true linear perspective going on. The painting actually feels quite flattened in a way, and that also is done on purpose because one of the things the modernists were interested in, it was psychological spaces, right? And this idea of what was going on inside your head and kind of trying to represent that. So he's giving us this kind of allegorical format of this kind of, beautiful mental dreamlike space. And these characters all kind of have their own story going on that feel quite separate from the rest, especially these two women, the way they're rendered, they look like a sticker almost just stuck right on the painting. So sometimes it's the lack of those elements, and that's what we would want to pick up on. Okay, there's not a super structured sense of space, and yet the painting still is asymmetrically balanced from side to side. There's definitely arbitrary color, and yet there's naturalism somewhat in an abstract way with, the idea of the trees and this kind of bright, highly saturated landscape of arbitrary color that lets us know that this is kind of more of a mental landscape than an actual physical one. There's a sense of outline that is actually an influence from the Japanese printmaking that the modernists were really into at this time, and a little bit earlier and a little bit later on, Van Gogh was interested in that as well as Picasso and Matisse as well. And so they were looking at this kind of flattening of space, this kind of almost, flat spaces of color that don't have a lot of variation to them. I mean, we have, a lot of brushstroke going on here as well. And that's something you can pick up on too, is the use of brushstroke. By not kind of rendering things perfectly smooth, it has a painterly quality. So we're reminded of the actual physical properties of the paint as well. So there's a lot going on here, and so I applaud you, that those of you who chose this one. And of course, I'm giving you a very, very small taste of analyzing these works of art, but just a few things I wanted to kind of go over with you. Okay, if we look at Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, a lot of you picked up on the idea of chiaroscuro, which of course is a very old technique that we saw with Caravaggio, but it's definitely present here as well. And we would definitely talk about the idea of primary colors here, the red, yellow, and blue, and of course there's a lot of green present as well. But this lends a lot of balance to the painting, a lot of structure. This is kind of tricky whether or not it's asymmetrically balanced or not. Some will say that it is because there's kind of this lightness here is balanced by the darkness over here. But remember that a painting is not always going to be symmetrical or asymmetrical. Sometimes it's, there's a lot more going on one side of the composition, and that's just fine. I mean, he does kind of balance us out by this darkness, but our eye is clearly being drawn over here with this bright yellow walls of the diner. Also, I want to talk about hatching here. Some of you were talking about there being hatching with the parallel lines going on. Again, this wouldn't really be considered hatching. This is really more just implied visual texture of the concrete. I just Googled hatching so you can kind of get a better idea of what it looks like. It's these really tight lines. So here's another example of what hatching tends to look like. So when we have a more smooth, this is a really good example of hatching as well. So, you know, these are kind of a little more chaotic. Van Gogh definitely uses it, an artist named Katie Kolvitz, which I believe was in lecture that I used for the example of hatching. This is a good example of hatching as well. So you can see that that's not really quite present here. Just because we see brush strokes and texture doesn't necessarily mean that hatching is present. So I wanted to make you aware of that as well. So a lot of you, though, I know only a few of you actually chose to write about this as well, but you guys did a pretty good job. Clearly, the biggest thing that's going on is color and the use of light that Hopper uses. And really, he was very interested in kind of this lonely landscape of the urban sprawl. And, you know, we can talk about how the people, they're engaging, but they feel very distinct and very separate from each other, all these people. I mean, if you really look closely, she's kind of just looking down at her hand. You know, he's doing his job. They're almost touching hands, but not quite. And then this guy's kind of over here by himself. There's nobody on the street. So it's this kind of, you know, being alone in the midst of a big city full of people that was one of the things that Edward Hopper was really interested in. So those are just some things I wanted to make you aware of. The other things I wanted to remind you of is that in these papers, these formal academic papers, you don't want to use first-person narrative voice. So you don't want to use I, me, my, etc. We want to keep them more formal. And one of the reasons is because when we write in first-person narrative, we're able to give our opinions, and opinions don't have to be validated with research or with analysis. They can kind of just be given. And so when you're doing, you know, papers like the formal analysis, and when we get to our museum reviews, I want you to keep that in mind. And a lot of you, an overwhelming amount of you, were using first-person narrative. That's why I wanted to address it. So if you have any questions about any of these works or any of the feedback I gave, please don't hesitate to ask. But overall, nice job, everyone.